So we're just speaking here with Dr. Malo Hutson, who's currently Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholar at the Department of Public Health at the University of Michigan, and he's also a faculty member of the Department of City and Regional Planning in the University of California at Berkeley. He's in town to speak at an event that's organized by our kitchen table. Dr. Malo, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the title of the talk tonight is Urban Sustainability and the Green Revolution. As we were speaking earlier, you said that there's a lot of attention in the media right now about this whole issue of sustainability, and it seems like everybody kind of is putting green in front of whatever they're doing. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of speak a little bit about what you think sustainability means.
Right. Well, sustainability, you're absolutely right, first of all. You hear in the media about green jobs, green products, everything's green, and so it's hard for people to sort of separate, well, what is green and what isn't, and what does sustainability mean in the first place. When I talk about sustainability and my colleagues and others, you're basically talking about leaving the environment, the economy, the health of people for future generations to also enjoy. So you don't want to just think about depleting the resources, but leaving further generations better off than what you came into the world as, having resources. Okay.
All right, that's a good place to sort of start with. And I mean, what's been your experience in terms of how receptive, whether they're city, departments, municipalities making this sort of shift, whether it's neighborhood organizations, businesses, any of those kinds of entities, in terms of how willing they are to and how viable it is to actually make that kind of a shift?
Right. Well, it's interesting. When I first got into this field, I was originally an urban planner, and I started to do work around economic development, community development, and then so many issues came up around health, and then from that, looking at environmental health, looking at our environment. And now you can find cities across the country having initiatives focused on sustainability, community development, talking about healthy cities, healthy communities. And what they're really talking about is, how do we improve our environment, having open space? How do we think about mixed land use so we aren't so dependent on oil? So you think about gas prices the way they are now. In my part of the country, in California, it's almost $5 a gallon in San Francisco. So now it's thinking, you see cities, city leaders, community organization folks, people in the community really thinking about, how do we build communities that are sustainable? How can I walk to the grocery store as opposed to drive? How will I be able to just walk to the park or ride my bike and so forth? So across the country, there are a number of initiatives from Seattle all the way to Boston.
Yeah, and what some things I've read from some people who are kind of assessing this have acknowledged that quite often that in the process of talking about how do we create transition to sort of more sustainable communities, that more often than not, maybe that particularly certain communities, particularly marginalized communities of color, tend to kind of either get ignored or minimalized, or even poorer communities in this process. Some people might even call it as a sort of form of environmental racism. I mean, how do you respond to those ideas?
I think they're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at our development in this country, I mean, going back to just World War II, and if you look at the subsidized monies that were set aside by the federal government for transportation to build suburban communities, and you had restrictive covenants that wouldn't allow for other ethnic groups to live in the suburban communities. So our cities have a long history of racial and economic segregation, which definitely impacts where we live. I mean, one of the most important things that people need to think about is place matters. Where you grew up matters. It matters for access to education, access to medical care, and all those things then have impacts on your overall socioeconomic position in society. So there are a number of factors that matter. And if you're looking at it from a health perspective, you can see that communities that are poor or overwhelmingly minority or people of color, they tend to have higher rates of cancer, asthma, diabetes, and other poor health status. And some of that has to do with the land uses. They have more exposure to environmental pollutants from industrial lands and things like that. So as we move forward, we really need to think about, as a region, so if we're thinking about Grand Rapids, how do we grow together? In Detroit, you have to think about, how do we grow together where you don't have certain communities that are exposed to these pollutants and toxins and so forth, because it's really going to affect the economic competitiveness of the region by having people who aren't a part of the economy, and that's definitely not helpful in this global economy that we're in now.
In the last year to 18 months, there's been one of the things that sort of has gotten attention maybe not necessarily in a positive way, but this whole push to sort of go to sort of alternative fuels and using corn for ethanol and so forth. It seems like it's sort of created its own sort of set of dilemma in terms of like using up grain resources, and it's not necessarily the most efficient in terms of as a fuel. How do communities avoid sort of quickly jumping into something without thinking through like the kind of complexities of what needs to happen in order for there to be real sustainability?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I think the most important thing is to act locally and think globally. I mean, I know it's a cliche and you hear it all the time. So what does that really mean? It means what can you do as an individual in your own community in terms of recycling, walking, and so forth, because we don't know down the road what might come, what new technologies might be invented. The big three automakers now are talking about developing electric cars or cars that might run on hydrogen. Now, every choice that we make with technology, there's going to be some repercussions. Some are positive, some are negative. So I think we have to think locally what's best for our particular community, wherever you may live, and then what are the different opportunities that you have? Is it to go in point A or go in direction B, and what the outcomes may be from that? So it's really forward thinking, but at the same time, you have to address the needs now. So I think some of the issues that you raise, I mean, if you look at the debate today around high gas prices, is to drill in Alaska. And so is that really a solution, or is it about us changing the way we behave and changing? And behavior is always the most difficult to change. But thinking about how do we change our behavior locally, and then how can that go regionally, statewide, and then nationally in order to make a difference. But you're absolutely right. It's a very complex issue, and it's going to take time before we figure out what technologies or what direction is the best way to move in, I think, for future generations.
For people who may be coming to hear you speak, this is southeast part of Grand Rapids, it's a disproportionately minority neighborhoods, disproportionately lower income neighborhoods. For people who are struggling with things like just, paying utilities, being able to feed their children, who may not even have employment or only can find employment that's way out somewhere and can't use mass transit to get to it. I mean, how do you speak to folks like that, where maybe what you're talking about maybe is not the forefront of their minds about what's important to them? Right.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, how do we, when we have daily needs that we have to have met, how do we think about tomorrow and when you're just trying to make ends meet? I mean, one of the things to think about is urban farming, certainly being at the farmers market and talking to urban farmers across the country, trying to grow your own fruits and vegetables in your backyard. Some people don't have a backyard, so you can think about how can you maybe carpool to the grocery store, or buy in bulk and share with your neighbors. And there are a number of local strategies that you can try to do, but certainly I think that when people have immediate needs, they need to be addressed. And I think that's when you really need to look at the role of city government and government in general at the national, local level, what have you, whether it be a Democrat or Republican. These are issues where we still believe that governance needs to play a role in all of this. And so what role can government play in improving the quality of life? So what policies might be able to impact people's lives immediately? We tried the rebate stimulus package, and still, there's a debate about how that's going. But certainly at the local level, we can think about things that we can do, whether it be having food banks or increasing the amount of food that we give out to help people in the meantime, but also trying to help them think about the future as well. And it's a tough task to do.
Okay. I'm assuming with your, the research that you've done and the work you've done around these kinds of issues, can you speak a bit about maybe some best practices that you're aware of in the country in terms of whether, again, it's municipalities or communities, individual communities that are, things that they're doing that really maybe we all can learn from?
Well, there's several. One of the biggest cities, Chicago, Mayor Daley and his staff are really working with local organizations as well as the city to think about how they build new buildings to not rely on so much energy, how they can collect rainwater and so forth. And there's a number of initiatives going on there, as well as in Seattle, they have a whole green building initiative. And Philadelphia has a Sustainable Philadelphia. And in my own neck of the woods in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's a new East Green Bay corridor, and that is to think about what do we do with industrial lands to really address jobs and housing and so forth. And so we're trying to think about green jobs, what jobs and educational programs need to be developed to help people who are living in poverty or economically disadvantaged to get better opportunities in education and the new economy that we're in now. So there are a number of best practices, and I would encourage people to contact their local city planning agencies or housing agencies to figure out what's going on locally to help them, and as well as educational programs at the local community college or high school.
Okay. And again, in terms of the way that this evening's event has sort of been presented to some degree on the flyer, is trying to look at the intersection between, you know, what does it mean to have a sustainable environment, you know, a healthy economy, and good health,
yes.
Public health. These obviously things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. In fact, you know, as one goes, they should all go.
Right.
But again, how do you kind of how do you present that so that people sort of see that these really are interdependent, you know, dynamics, that we need all of them in order to have any of them work well?
Well, you're absolutely right. And I think the way I've tried to set my talk up today is to really talk about the economy, which people can understand, and how big the green jobs and the renewable energy economies are. According to the latest study that I've seen, in 2006, the green and energy renewable economy is about $970 billion in revenue in 2006, and it accounts for about 8.5 million jobs, and that's going to continue to grow. That's something that gets people's attention. And then when you talk about jobs, you have to talk about education, you have to talk about housing, and from there you get into other issues that people can relate to. And then finally, looking at the environment. I mean, we all breathe the same air, we drink the same water, and we can really understand what it means to have pollution in our communities, or if you even live in a place that's very green, like Grand Rapids, versus living in the Bronx, New York, we still understand the impact the environment has on our lives. And I think it's important to raise people's awareness to that, of sort of, do you have to drive every day versus walk? Do you have access to open space? Do you have access to healthy foods and not just a liquor store? And I think those are the things that I try to touch on, is just the everyday issues that we deal with in our daily lives, going to work, going to school, just going to shop, to think about how we can be more green, and how this economy and the way we've built our environment affects our everyday life.
Okay. Well, you know, obviously that maybe one issue that has brought more of this, the importance of this to the forefront, is just around global warming, you know, through a variety of mechanisms, but it's kind of hard to go throughout a day without it not being part of the news or in some capacity. And of course, many of the researchers say that we have sort of a window of opportunity. It's not a very big one necessarily, but we have this window of opportunity. I mean, from where you sit and the work that you do, I mean, are you hopeful that we can actually turn it around, that we can actually make these kind of changes that are necessary for us to have a vibrant future? That's
a great question. I am optimistic. I mean, if you think about whenever this country has come against challenges in the world, we've tend to rise to those challenges. And I think now we have a new generation of people coming along that says, look, there's a better way to do things. So I think with our innovation that we've always had in this country, thinking about new technologies, new ways to do things, I think it's definitely positive. I have definitely a positive outlook on what's going to happen in the future. I think it has a start, as I said, with the individual and the local level, and then from there thinking about national policy. It's hard to have someone think right away about national or international policies, but think about what can you do on a local level. Keep it simple, and from there realize how you can attach to new movements around this whole issue of whether it be urban sustainability, or the environment, or equity, whatever your issue is, to think about how you can improve the world. And I think that we have a new generation of people coming up thinking about these issues. And so I'm optimistic and hope that we can indeed make a change.
Okay. Well, maybe just by way of closing, I'm just wondering if you could recommend some resources of people wanting to further explore, if there are websites or organizations or books or something that you think that are a good sort of starting point for people to explore these issues further.
Sure. I think people could start off by going to CDC. They have a Healthy Communities web page, and I don't have that exact, but the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, you can just go there. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency also has a number of links from their website that will allow people to read up on these issues. And there are a number of books that are quite interesting. One is Place Matters, which is not a direct discussion about the environment per se, but it definitely deals with the issues of regional inequities and how do we grow and how do our metropolitan areas grow in an equitable manner. And there are a number of books that deal with healthy communities in urban design and so forth. So I would direct people to go there. And finally, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has a number of great links from their website that deal with obesity, the built environment, and so forth. And people can go to www.rwjf.org, and that's something I know best about. So since I'm a RWJ fellow. So.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Dr. Hutson, for joining us.
Thank you very much.